One of the biggest challenges when it comes to podcast discoverability is, of course, the ability for people to discover your show when they don't even realize that they want to listen to a podcast. Perhaps they're just searching for a search term, and it just so happens that the data that they receive back from their search engine is in the form of audio. That is Google's big ambition when it comes to podcasting. In fact, they've stated that they want to actually double podcast consumption overall, and that is the topic of today's Podcast Accelerator episode. How do I actually get my podcast in Google Podcasts so that all that good stuff can happen? As I said, this is the Podcast Accelerator. I'm your host, Mark Astwith, that British podcast guy and CEO and co-founder here at Rebel Base Media, where we make podcasting tools and software, including Captivate.fm, the world's only growth-oriented podcast host. Go and check that out if you want to host multiple shows for one cost. If you want access to the world's finest podcast player that actually works on all devices as well, please go and check that out, Captivate.fm, for a 7-day free trial. So, I'm very fortunate to know Zach and the Google team who work on podcasts. They've got lofty ambitions and they do wondrous work in the podcasting space. They've only really been in it for a couple of years. I was fortunate enough to be at Rain Summit and Podcast Movement and speak at those events and be there with the Google team, to speak at Harvard with the Google team, and just kind of see, firsthand the approach that Zach and the team has got. But there's one thing that Google does that's still a little confusing, and that is submission. How the heck do you submit your podcast into Google? So we're going to crush that in just 1 second. But before I do that, I just want to give a big holler to the team at AWeber, Chris and Brandon, the team over there, who still help me to create wondrous email marketing for my audience. We use it for example, we've just been upgrading Podcast Websites Members, our managed WordPress platform, been upgrading those guys to use the Captivate hosting and analytics module, so they integrate tightly into each other. We've run through an upgrade process, and sure enough, AWeber's communication skills has been at the center of that. And that's just one way that I use AWeber to run my business, never mind all the engagement that I get with my podcast listeners. So please, if you're not using email to engage with your audience, you are missing a trick, and you're leaving potential revenue, you're leaving potential sponsorships and listener support on the table. So go and check it out now, markasquith.com/AWeber. Right, let's talk Google. From the confusion between Google Play and Google Podcasts to the weird way that Google finds your show if you aren't a techie, Google has got big ambitions in the space, but it isn't always as user-friendly as you'd expect. Now, this is one thing that I really like about Google, is that everything generally is pretty user-friendly. It's pretty clear what's going on. I actually found out very recently that if you're in Chrome, I don't even know if this works in Safari, but if you're in Chrome, if you type sheets.new or doc.new into your browser, it just creates a new Google Sheet for you or a new Google document. Like, it's that kind of stuff that I love about Google, and Apple as well do this sort of stuff. That's the sort of thing that I like. But just like many other companies and many other brands, podcasting through Google can be a little confusing. Now, let's just put this into a little bit of context. Number one, Google is a podcast directory. It's a big podcast directory. I believe it's one of the big three. Spotify, Apple, and Google are the big three that absolutely, if all else fails, you should absolutely be in those three, all right? But Google doesn't work like those two. So if you're using, let's use Captivate.fm, the hosting platform that we run as the example. If you are trying to submit to Spotify, you literally click a button and it submits to Spotify. Your show submits to Spotify. To submit to Apple, it's a little bit more convoluted. You click a button, you click submit, it fires up a window, we populate your URL for you, your RSS feed URL, gets validated, and sure enough, you submit. That's it, you press a button. But Google isn't quite the same as that. No, Google works a little bit more like it works when it comes to indexing websites. So the way that this works, and I understand why they do this, because ultimately an RSS feed is just a source of information. It's just a feed, an XML file of information. That is it. So it's like a web page, essentially. An RSS feed is essentially like a web page. Yes, the purists and the techies are going to kick my ass for that, but for all intents and purposes, it's like a web page in that Google can read it and discern information about what you've got in that feed and display it properly. Now, when it comes to websites, what Google does is it asks you to basically tell it that your website exists by either validating it through a meta tag or analytics or the old webmaster tools, Search Console. And Google then basically says, right, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look through all this good stuff on your website, and then when someone searches for something, either your brand or something that we think you can help people with, I'm going to display the relevant information from your website in the search results. The same goes for YouTube. So when it comes to your podcast, essentially Google is trying to do the same thing. So back to podcasting, back to hosting. Right. The way that this works then is inside your RSS feed, or ultimately inside your Captivate.fm hosting settings, or whoever you host with, inside your Captivate podcast settings, what you do is you put your website address, all right? So you'll put markasquith.com. So for the Podcast Accelerator, I put markasquith.com as my website. Now, that's all well and good, because when Google sees the RSS feed, it will understand that there's a website associated with it. The problem with it is there's no easy way of telling Google to look at the RSS feed. So what we're required to do is actually the exact opposite of what we do with the RSS feed. So with the RSS feed, we put our web address in and say to Google, look, when you read this feed, just know that this website address is associated with this podcast. All right? So put that website link in the podcast so people know what's related, okay? But what we then need to do is we need to add another tag into the head of our website. Now, you can do this through WordPress. Captivate Sync, which is our WordPress plugin, supports this. It's automatic. You don't have to do any coding. It just does it for you. Captivate Sites, if you want to build an automatic mini website with Captivate, an automated podcast website for your show using Captivate, again, it's all taken care of. You don't have to worry. But if you are kind of a quote-unquote old-school webmaster, you are going to need to grab a little bit of code from Google, and you can find this. We'll stick this. It's actually in our tutorials on Captivate, the help section of Captivate, help.captivate.fm. The URL, or the little tag that you put in to Google, into your website to tell Google that your show basically exists, is a little piece of code that goes in the header of your website that says, oh, by the way, you know, Google, you know, when you look at my website, look, I've also got a podcast and this is the link to it. And it follows the link. And then when it sees the podcast RSS feed, it says, oh, wait a sec. You're right. There's a link back to the website in this RSS feed because we've put it in the show settings in Captivate. So it's in the feed. You're right. Got this. Yep, I understand. So this podcast is related to this website. Got it. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to look through all the information. And when someone types in something relevant, I might not just show your website. I might show your podcast as well. All right. That's the goal with Google, is to increase listenership via episode level downloads and by giving information. I truly predict that, you know, like YouTube, when you search for like how to thread a needle, you'll get a 15-minute video, but the 30-second clip on how to thread the needle will be highlighted for you in the search results. I think that's what's going to happen with podcasting. I think we're going to start to see snippets. We're going to start to see, all right, here's an episode of podcasting that talks about how to get your podcast in Google, but specifically, you want this 30-second segment of Mark's episode here. Click to play and I'll jump to that section for you. I think that's what Google are doing. Zach, if I remember correctly, and I am paraphrasing this one, don't take my word for it, I'm pretty sure Zach confirmed that something along those lines was going on at Podcast Movement. James Cridland, if you're listening, please correct me if I'm wrong on that one. But I believe that's the way it's going to go. So it's vital that your show is in Google. It's just a shame that there's no submit button. It's not like, all right, okay, go and submit your show to Google. It's not as easy as that. But ultimately, it's a little bit more of a rigorous process. It actually does work really, really well if you understand it. Now, your host, Captivate.fm, whoever else you host with, hopefully your other host, if it's not Captivate, will support this. Captivate absolutely does. So if we generate you an automatic podcast website, boom, it's fine. Google will be taken care of. If you use Captivate Sync, our WordPress plugin, fine, all well and good. We'll take care of you on that as well. It's all automatically done, all right? One thing to finish on, Google Play is not Google Podcasts. Google Play is a entirely different thing that is deprecated, that isn't really in use for podcasts. So you see, I still see people now on Facebook, I don't know why people aren't correcting them, in some communities that are paid for communities, saying, I've just submitted to Google Play, yay me, and the owner of the community who is taking the money is saying, yay, well done, not saying, actually, Google Play is deprecated. You should be in Google Podcasts because that's the real one. Okay, that's a weird thing to see on Facebook, you know. So just remember, Google Play is not the thing your podcast needs to be in anymore. It's Google Podcasts. All right. I know it's confusing. I wish Google would change that, but alas, up until now they haven't. All right. So please check that out. That's how Google Podcasts works when it comes to indexing your feed. I know it's a little bit complicated. Go back and listen to this again if you want to. We've got some tutorials on it actually on Captivate.fm. This is not an advert for Captivate. I know it feels like that today, but it's not. But we do have some interesting tutorials on help.captivate.fm that anyone can use, so go and check that out. Thank you for joining me. It's always a pleasure. Cheers, ears. And until the next time, tell your friends about the show if you think they would benefit from it. Do check out Captivate. And until the next time, never forget, the more you expect from yourself, the more you will excel.